Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to look at 3 stories of people who found themselves in absolutely horrific situations and came out of them alive, but it didn't really make what happened to them any less horrific. In fact, I found one of these stories to be so disturbing that it inspired an entire video that's coming out later this month. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. About 100,000 Americans are currently waiting for organ transplants, but with nearly 170 million registered donors, you'd think the odds of getting a life-saving heart, liver, or kidney would be relatively good. But that's just not the case, and as a result, approximately 17 Americans waiting for organs die every day. Growing up in central Kentucky, Anthony, or TJ Hoover, lost 2 brothers to drug addiction. The deaths had such a profound impact on his life that he dropped out of his high school and joined the Job Corps at the age of 16. TJ and his older sister Donna hoped the Job Corps would give him a sense of purpose and get his life back on track, but in many respects, his timing couldn't have been any worse. At the time, he was already experiencing bouts of depression and anxiety because he was never able to come to terms with his brother's deaths. Then, in the summer of 2005, TJ was sent to help with the cleanup efforts after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and shortly after arriving, he witnessed death and devastation unlike anything most of us can possibly imagine. His depression and anxiety then got even worse, and when it was all said and done, he developed a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder. Doctors then prescribed him a powerful medication to help him deal with what he saw, but the medication to help him apparently made him feel like such a zombie that he couldn't hold down a job or live a remotely normal life. So he eventually turned to drugs just like his brothers had years before, and he used drugs on and off over the next decade and a half, but even still, he got on with his life about as well as could be expected. At least he did, until his mother passed away in mid-2021. Monday, October 25th, 2021 would have been her birthday, and that afternoon, his sister Donna found him lying face down on the pavement shortly after it told her he was going outside to put a few things in the car. She immediately knew he had overdosed and he had no pulse and wasn't breathing when EMTs arrived shortly thereafter. They then rushed him to a hospital, and when they arrived, TJ was in cardiac arrest. Tragically, Donna and a number of other family members got to the hospital just as doctors were placing TJ on life support. The following morning, a doctor told them he had no brain activity or reflexes and that without life support, he'd probably die. So after careful consideration, the family agreed to change his status to do not resuscitate. The family then got an unexpected visit from representatives from the Kentucky Organ Donor Affiliates, otherwise known as CODA. They then informed TJ's family that he was a registered organ donor and that if everything went according to plan, his organs might save a life or two. Considering how tragic and heartbreaking the situation was, they took some comfort in knowing that he might not have died in vain. Surgeons and support staff then spent the next few days performing various tests on TJ's organs, one of which was a cardiac catheterization on the morning of Friday, October 29th. As TJ lay on an operating table, a thin tube was inserted in a blood vessel in his groin, arm, or wrist. Then it was pushed through the vessel to his heart using an X-ray machine for guidance. This test allowed doctors to see if his coronary arteries were blocked or whether his heart muscles or valves had any problems. Local anesthetics are used when this procedure is performed on live patients, but even so, it's always uncomfortable and sometimes downright painful. But pain and discomfort shouldn't have been an issue in TJ's case because as far as doctors were concerned, he was essentially brain dead. But to everyone's surprise, he allegedly began moving around on the operating table shortly after the doctor inserted the catheter. Records later showed he had purposeful movement to pain, eyes open and tracking, and was thrashing around. Several staff were reportedly extremely uncomfortable, and the cardiologist gave TJ a paralytic and sedated him so the test could be completed. Later that afternoon, the hospital staff held a brief ceremony known as an honor walk. Honor walks are the staff's way of paying their respects to the donor and the supporting family. As TJ was wheeled down the hall, it was particularly heartbreaking for TJ's sister Donna because they'd always been so close. And again, she'd already lost 2 other brothers to drug overdoses. But before TJ disappeared into the operating room, she allegedly noticed his eyes twitching, and fractions of a second later, they opened. To Donna's surprise, her brother's eyes apparently stayed laser-focused on her face as the gurney approached the operating room doors. She immediately informed members of the staff, but they told her it happened all the time and it wasn't cause for alarm. From a medical standpoint, the explanation made sense, and anyway, Donna was just a humble restaurant manager. As she put it, who was she to question doctors and medical staff? But even despite this reassurance, she just couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Preparations for organ harvesting began as usual in the operating room that day. An organ perfusionist was one of the CODA employees assigned to the case, and her job was preparing and packing the organs immediately after removal. This involves flushing the organs with a solution to remove excess blood and slow cellular metabolism. After that, she would typically pack the organs in sterile containers at just above freezing temperatures. As the surgical team continued, witnesses say TJ allegedly began exhibiting telltale signs of life, and some of those present later said they believed his movements weren't just random involuntary spasms. What started out as twitching and shaking eventually morphed into what stunned witnesses later described as thrashing. And to be clear, at this point, they were still just shaving TJ's chest. According to the perfusionist, it seemed to her that TJ was moving voluntarily and aware of what was happening. She said she even saw tears rolling down his face as he shook his head as if to say no. The atmosphere in the operating room, as you might imagine by this point, was emotional and tense. In the heat of the moment, the CoAg case coordinator called a supervisor to ask what to do. Witnesses said the supervisor pushed for the case to proceed, leaving the coordinator in tears. But when the pronouncing physician arrived, she refused to declare TJ dead. The surgeon who had been scheduled to perform the recovery also left, saying he wanted no part of it. The procedure was then stopped and TJ was taken back to the ICU. As all of this was going on, TJ's family was still in the hospital waiting room for word that the surgery was over. Slightly more than an hour after the honor walk, one of the doctors appeared and told them that TJ woke up and that he wasn't ready. Donna also recalls being told that TJ might not survive very long and that she should consider taking him home and making him comfortable. As you might imagine as well, the doctor's statement was nothing short of earth-shattering. Either intentionally or unintentionally, it confirmed Donna's suspicion that her brother was still alive and that there was a chance he might actually pull through. Thankfully, she decided not to take him home. Instead, TJ spent the next few weeks in the hospital. Donna said the hospital staff regularly told her that TJ might never fully recover and that she'd be better off sending him to live in an out-of-state nursing home. She couldn't imagine anything worse, and in the end, she took him to her home in Richmond, Kentucky. She then spent so much time trying to nurse him back to health over the next few months that she lost her job as a restaurant manager. The Kentucky Attorney General's office eventually opened an investigation to determine how TJ could have had such a harrowing brush with a horrific end. The Federal Health Resources and Services Administration also opened an investigation, and as of now, the investigation is still ongoing. As for TJ himself, his road to recovery was littered with hurdles and pitfalls of nearly every description. His memory, eyesight, and balance were permanently impaired, but through it all, Donna marveled at how he maintained a positive attitude and even a sense of humor. TJ eventually began seeing a physical therapist, and by the spring of 2023, he was well enough to walk his sister Donna down the aisle. We don't know when Wang Nan and Yu Xiaodong met or how long they'd been together when they finally got married. But at some point, Nan had developed a successful online business that made the family more money than she and her husband ever dreamed possible. This money should have given them peace and financial security, but ironically, it drove a huge wedge between them by fueling Yu's out-of-control gambling addiction. By late 2018 or early 2019, he allegedly racked up nearly 2 million yuan, or about $275,000 in online gambling debt. And although Nan knew that Yu was a gambler, she was absolutely floored when she found out how big the problem really was. Yu begged his wife to give him the money to pay off the debt, and if she did, he said he'd stop gambling altogether. She did have more than enough money to settle the debt once and for all, but after careful consideration, she decided to give him half the money and make him come up with the rest of it himself. He wasn't happy about Nan's decision, but despite the friction between them, Nan eventually got pregnant. Then in the summer of 2019, they flew to Thailand for a much-needed vacation about 3 months before the baby's scheduled due date. There, they visited Pha Tem National Park on the morning of Sunday, June 9th, 2019. This is a 130 square mile park located in the rugged, remote region of east-central Thailand along the border with Laos, and the park is most well known for its waterfalls, rock formations, and ancient cave art. Early that morning, Nan, Yu, and dozens of other visitors made their way to the 111-foot or 34-meter Alexander the Great viewpoint to watch the sunrise. They got there a few minutes early, took up their positions along the precarious viewpoint, and waited for it to begin. And Nan hoped that watching the sunrise together would be a romantic way to help mend their rocky relationship. Just as the first sliver of sun appeared on the horizon, Yu gently kissed Nan on the cheek. At that moment, the troubles that drove them apart seemed to vanish, and moments later, Yu leaned in like he was going to whisper something sweet in her ear. But to her surprise, instead, he told her to go to hell, and then before she could react, he pushed her over the precipice. It only took a few seconds for Nan to fall more than 110 feet to the rocky ground below the viewpoint. And as stunned visitors looked on with horror, she landed with a loud, stomach-turning thump. Moments later, frantic park employees rushed to her while visitors who witnessed the incident shouted and pointing at Yu accusingly. He was then taken into custody, and an ambulance crew eventually arrived and rushed his pregnant, semi-conscious wife to the nearby hospital. She was still breathing and had a faint pulse, but it looked like she might not make it. Doctors quickly determined that she had severe internal bleeding, and closer inspection revealed that she had more than a dozen broken bones. She would go on to spend what seemed like an eternity in intensive care, and her wounds required more than 100 steel pins and 200 stitches. But, remarkably, she regained consciousness after a series of tricky surgeries. She would then beat the odds and survived what should have been a fatal fall, but tragically, her unborn child wasn't so lucky. We don't know exactly what happened during Yu's trial in Thai court, but the general consensus was that he tried to kill Nan because he wanted to inherit her substantial assets. This would mean he'd be able to pay off his debt and continue gambling without her breathing down his neck. After a short trial, Yu was convicted of murder and attempted murder and sentenced to nearly 3.5 decades in Thai prison. Nan spent much of the next 3 years in bed and in her wheelchair recuperating and slowly regaining her strength. She knew she was lucky to be alive, but her husband's despicable actions and the loss of her unborn child were far harder to cope with than the physical injuries. Things got even worse when doctors informed her that she probably wouldn't be able to get pregnant again. But as bad as this news was, Nan wasn't going to give up on her dream of becoming a mother, and before long she got pregnant via in vitro fertilization. It's unclear who the father was, but whatever the case, she felt like she'd been slapped in the face when she found out that per Chinese law, Yu would have to be listed as a father on the child's birth certificate because they were still legally married. And in another tragic twist of fate, Nan also discovered that getting a divorce would be difficult and perhaps impossible. According to Chinese law, both spouses had to be physically present in marital court during divorce proceedings. Obviously, this just wasn't possible because Yu was locked away in a Thai prison for the next 30 years. So at that point, all Nan could do was send word to Yu that she wanted a divorce and humbly and respectfully asked him to grant it. But when he got her request, he informed her attorney that she'd need to cough up 30 million yuan, or about $4 million if she wanted him to grant her a speedy and uncontested divorce. Despite all of this though, she made a trip to Pha Tem National Park in the spring of 2024, nearly 5 years after her husband pushed her. Then, back in China, Nan joyously announced the birth of her son on September 17th. In the days that followed, her Weibo post featuring a photo of her and her son got more than 30 million views. Nan's divorce was still pending as of late 2024, but she may have summed up her life best on her Douyin profile when she wrote, quote, "I was always a warm person, I was just trapped in a long nightmare. The future is still long, I need time to heal, and I will get better." On March 11th, 1984, a fishing trawler named the Helisea VE-503 was doing its best to battle the choppy, white-capped waters of the freezing North Atlantic. Among the 5 fishermen aboard was CoAg, a 23-year-old who stood 6'3" and weighed 275 pounds. He was built like the kind of man who had been hauling fishing nets since he could walk, but that night he was just another man hoping to make it back to the safety of land. The 5 fishermen were working the waters off Jaime Island, the largest of Iceland's Westman Islands, and as it approached 10 o'clock that night, the North Atlantic conditions were already cold and windy. Making matters even worse for the trawler was that it was probably sailing just a little heavy that evening, or maybe the math was off. But whatever it was, it happened so fast. The trawl net suddenly caught on the ocean floor. There was no warning, just suddenly the boat pitched violently and capsized, flipping so fast no one even had a chance to think about a distress signal. CoAg then felt the terrifying breathlessness of the icy ocean as it swallowed him whole. Somewhere nearby, men were screaming, somewhere else they were already silent. Somehow, 3 of them found the upturned keel, which was a slick, frozen piece of metal barely wide enough to perch on. CoAg then hauled himself up with his 2 fellow fishermen. Tragically, the other 2 never resurfaced after being tossed from the boat. To contrast the chaos of what was going on, the sky above them was deceptively clear. Air temperature sat at 28 degrees Fahrenheit or -2 Celsius, but with the wind screaming off the sea, it felt far worse. The ocean around them was also just 41 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 Celsius, cold enough to kill a man in just a few minutes. CoAg knew the numbers, every fisherman did. Waiting would almost certainly mean death, but for the next 45 minutes, the 3 men clung to the hull as the wind did its best to try to peel them off and the cold turned their soaked clothes into ice. The problem was that no rescue was coming. No one even knew they were there. At some point, CoAg looked at the 2 men beside him and made the call no one wanted to say out loud. They would have to swim. So one by one, they slipped from the hull back into the black ocean waters. This would be the last time CoAg saw another living soul that night. It's hard to overstate just how cold water just above freezing is. Beyond just the physical pain, in seas like that, your muscles lock, blood thickens, and lungs burn. Around him, the black water swallowed everything. Most times he couldn't even see out of the swell he was in. There was no horizon, just the occasional glint of a lighthouse that seemed impossibly far away. The decision to swim wasn't a brave one. It wasn't even a decision really, it was just what had to be done, but within moments, CoAg was left on his own. The other 2 fishermen were quickly taken by the sea. Although he was now the lone survivor of the 5, moving was the only way to buy a little more time. Through it all, CoAg kept swimming. Somewhere in the dark ahead of them, the lighthouse blinked, and CoAg locked onto that light like it was the only thing in the world. The hours blurred into one another, and he couldn't tell how long he'd been swimming, but it didn't matter anyway. The cold should have killed him within that first hour, but beneath soaked layers of cotton and wool, his body held reserves he didn't even know he had. As he swam, he soon noticed something strange. There was a shape above the water gliding beside him. It was a bird, an Arctic fulmar, white and gray against the black sky, keeping pace with him. Gulager couldn't explain it, but it seemed like he wasn't alone out there after all. The bird circled and he stared at it between breaths and swore it nodded at him once. At the same time in the sky was a single bright star through the clouds, shining down like it was lighting the way. In the midst of all this, Gulager couldn't help but think that something or someone was watching over him as he kept making his way closer to the shore. By the time the dark silhouette of Jaime Island finally got close, it still felt impossibly far. Although the island was right there, the shoreline was jagged volcanic rock. After his Herculean effort over the course of 6 long hours, Gulager finally reached the island and clawed his way up the first stretch of jagged rock. Then the next wave hit the island, slamming Gulager sideways and peeling him off the rock face. As he stared at the cliffs, he felt the first sense of doubt creep over him. After the cold, the dark, and the endless water, this might be where it ended, just inches from survival, but too exhausted to keep fighting. He pushed himself off the rocks and let the ocean take him again. He then swam along the shoreline, searching in the dark for any kind of break in the cliffs. Time blurred once again until finally a flatter section appeared. It wasn't necessarily safe or soft, but it was climbable. He then hauled himself out of the water with his exhausted limbs barely responding. As he tried to catch his breath on the relatively dry land, he quickly came to a new realization. The ground wasn't dirt or grass, it was volcanic screed, shards of razor-sharp rock hidden beneath a dusting of snow. Simultaneously barefoot and soaked, he had to move inland. There was no telling how far he'd have to walk to find civilization, and as he lifted his foot and placed it back onto the scree, the rock cut him deeply. He then took another step and was cut again. Every rock just cut deeper and deeper, but he continued moving forward. After walking for a while, Gulager spotted a water trough used for sheep just ahead. He then staggered toward it, only to find the surface was completely frozen. And although he was cold, wet, and bloody, more than anything, he was dehydrated. A 6-hour swim and a long walk over volcanic rock had depleted his fluids. He then balled up his fist and broke the ice, and thankfully there was liquid underneath. He then drank until his hands went numb, and then he kept walking with blood trailing behind him. By the time Gulager saw the first flicker of civilization, he barely resembled a person anymore. His feet were numb and bloodied, his soaked clothes were now rigid, and his skin was raw from the salt, ice, and volcanic stone. As he approached, he realized the lights ahead weren't from an unmanned lighthouse, they were actually coming from houses that contained people inside them. It was just after 7 a.m., 9 hours since his boat flipped, and about 8 since he should have succumbed to the sea. He then stumbled through the last stretch as the adrenaline wore off, and he reached a door and knocked. Inside, the farmer who opened the door would later swear that he thought he was looking at a dead man standing in front of him. Gulager's lips were blue and his skin was pale, and blood ran down his legs. The homeowner then rushed him inside, and you would think at this point he would collapse, but Gulager apparently simply walked in and sat down calm and controlled. The doctors who examined Gulager at the hospital nearby probably expected the worst: frostbite, organ failure, and hypothermia. Taking his temperature, they learned that Gulager's insides sat at 93 degrees Fahrenheit or 33.8 Celsius, which was well into the danger zone for hypothermia. By every medical standard, he should have been unconscious and barely clinging to life. But instead, Gulager was talking, coherent, and clear-headed. The only thing they treated him for was dehydration and deep bloody cuts on his feet. He had no frostbite and no permanent damage. Word of his survival spread quickly across Jaime, then the mainland, and beyond Iceland. Fishermen swapped the story like a myth, shaking their heads and swearing it couldn't be true. Survival experts didn't believe it either, at least not at first. They ran the numbers and did the math, and it never added up. No one swims 3.7 miles or 6 kilometers in near freezing water for 6 hours and lives, especially not in jeans and a sweater. So in 1985, curious scientists brought him to London to figure out how he pulled it off. They put him through test after test, dunked him in cold water, measured his vitals, and watched as he apparently shrugged off freezing temperatures. It was learned through these tests that he was a physiological outlier. That thick layer of body fat had wrapped around him like a human wetsuit, preventing hypothermia. And where others would panic, Gulager remained calm. This can maybe be characterized as Icelandic grit from generations of staring down brutal seas and unforgiving winters. Years later, in 2012, a film called The Deep immortalized the night that Gulager survived the North Atlantic. In the Westman Islands as well, the sheep trough that Gulager came upon was transformed into a monument to his toughness and superhuman survival, as well as to honor the 4 men who lost their lives that night. And in 1985, a new tradition was started on Jaime Islands. Every year since, swimmers gather for the Swim of Gulager. Participants swim 6 kilometers, the same impossible distance he did that night, only they do it in a heated pool while being cheered on by a crowd. Today, Gulager is now in his 60s. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.